Valentino Garavani championed Italian fashion in a way no one had since Elsa Schiaparelli herself. But what was it that made Valentino so special? And how did he grow his business to the scale it is today? In order to understand this, we must first understand the scene of haute couture in Paris, because by the 1950s, French couture was back to its place as the dominant center of global fashion after being almost destroyed by the Nazis, and it's here, between 1952 and 1959, that one could find Valentino Garavani as a budding young fashion designer who'd come to the city and to the country to follow his dreams. First working with couturier Giammetti for 5 years, and then with Guy Laroche for 2. But he soon felt highly unwelcome in Paris, becoming disillusioned with France as a place to grow his career. In short, he was left with the reality that now, after 7 years of experience, he would have to return to Rome and give up on his Paris couture dreams. This video is informed by these books. I'll put the source up on the top left as usual and affiliate links for them down below if you're interested in buying them for yourself or if you want to recommend them to your local library. However, these books obviously do not cover more modern Valentino, as you can tell, so as a one-off, I have saved all of the sources from places like Vogue, the New York Times, and news sites like The Guardian, and I'll put links for them down below as well. I'm told this does actually hurt my channel to have too many links in the description box below, so if you wouldn't mind sharing this video or commenting, liking, anything like that, I would be really grateful. It's often stated in books about the history of Valentino that even as late as the early 1960s, Parisian couture at this time was very xenophobic. To quote Morris's Valentino Universe of Fashion, foreigners were not welcome, though they were allowed to come as workers. Of course, if you follow my channel, you know this really not to be the case. Schiaparelli, who was also Italian, had already been working in Paris for decades by this point, for example, and Karl Lagerfeld, who was German, though hiding his heritage, had managed to forge an illustrious career after having moved to Paris in the same year as Mr. Garavani in 1952. So, what is probably a more truthful statement is that after the war, which don't forget happened at the same time as the Mussolini dictatorship in Italy, there was a sense of fear in the foreign across the world, but especially to Germans and Italians. So to Garavani, this was very likely very noticeable in France, and even more so for the Chambre Syndicale, who had nearly been destroyed themselves by the Nazi desire to move all of couture to either Berlin or Vienna during their occupancy. Nevertheless, it was for this reason that Valentino felt sufficiently unwelcome by 1959 that he decided that, with financial help from his father and from his father's associate, he would begin his own studio in his home country of Rome, on 11 Via Condotti. The Via Condotti was, and still is, an incredibly prime location for a shop, right near the Piazza di Spagna and not far off the Trevi Fountain. This gorgeous space would have cost an arm and a leg for his father and for his associate even at this time, and really was an extreme extravagance for them to spend so much on a designer that, by his own admission, didn't really have any idea on how to run a business. To quote Valentino himself, he said, "I had no idea what I was getting into. Sometimes ignorance is a wonderful thing." However, with that said, he did actually have one thing working for him, and that was his French haute couture experience. During this time, Italy was not seen as the place for high fashion. In fact, it wasn't even widely considered to be a luxurious place to buy clothes from at all, as Italian craftsmanship was not yet considered desirable as it is today. Instead, Italy was the place for, quote, bright, attractive sports clothes, narrow, calf-length trousers known as capri pants, Italian knits, especially in silk and cashmere, Italian evening dresses and tailored clothes also appealed to both vacationers and store buyers, thanks to the many local dressmakers who bought styles in Paris to be copied in their own workrooms. In fact, while even the most famous of Italian designers, like Simonetta, who is on your screen right now, weren't seen as truly fashionable in the same way that Parisian couturiers were, the real edge, or two edges, that Italy had over France was firstly the fact that it was cheap. Italian labor was so cheap, in fact, that designs could be sold at 30 to 50% less, and secondly, because it was fast. Instead of the 6 weeks wait that you would have in Paris, Italy could produce in 2. So really, for these two reasons alone, their Florentine Alta Moda shows were successful. It just wasn't the first place that high society would buy clothes from, especially considering that the end product simply wasn't as good as the Parisian couture. This can be attributed to one very important step in garment production that was missing in Italian design, namely the working drawing. The working drawing for Valentino really was just a plan of what he might want, often describing all of the functional elements of a garment which make it better for the end consumer and make it more aesthetically pleasing. Things like the exact buttons or pockets, the type of sleeve, all of those small details. In fact, it's stated that this is the exact reason that Valentino went to work in Paris for Jean Dess in the first place, to learn about this technique. However, it was not exactly what the atelier would produce, as Valentino uniquely was never tied to his initial sketch in the same way that many other designers are. In fact, you can see that in this sketch produced after the garment was constructed. The level of detail is just far more intricate. So instead, he was actually using his initial sketch not as instructions, but more of a guideline to allow the dress to develop as it's draped, even if it was not by himself. He immediately worked to produce the most beautiful dress, not necessarily the dress that he sketched. This is something you can actually still see in the 2008 documentary Valentino the Last Emperor, in which he even gives credit for the draping of the dress to the head of his atelier. So, when I say his edge over other Alta Moda designers was experience, what I mean to say was he took these elements from the famed quality of French couture and used it to differentiate himself from the otherwise speedy, cheaper Italian labor. He worked in pursuit of beauty, not in exact recreations. He also had good backers, a phenomenally located shop, and had much cheaper Italian labor to create his first collection. Eventually, this first collection, Abyss, would debut later that year, in the November of 1959 for the 1959 spring-summer season. The collection consisted of 120 styles and was presented in his salon at the 11th Via Condotti. The collection, considering it was only his first, was actually met with decent critical success, though it should be pointed out that journalists seemed to be more taken by the setting than the clothes. To quote Carter for the Sunday Times, he said, "His salon in the apartments of Guglielmo Marconi is the most splendid in Rome, and at his first collection for foreign buyers, he presented 120 models." Interestingly, this is also something that Valentino himself reflected on later in many interviews, though one specifically with Eugenia Shepherd for New York magazine, in which he said, "The collection was full of ideas, but had no personality." He continues in Valentino 30 Years of Magic to say, "When I first started out, I created collections with 200,000 ideas. 30 would have been enough." So really, while his method was innovative for Italy, his design style really wasn't, and we can assume from what was said at the time that if the setting wasn't as marvelous as it was, it probably wouldn't have been the showstopper that it is reported as today. In the years since, some editors have even suggested that the collection was good because his collection was light and airy and thus away from the structured designs of Dior and Givenchy that was popular at the time, but actually this seems to be a bit of a stretch, as in that matter, his light and airy designs were not really that different from what was going on in Paris couture, as it was very reminiscent of what Jean Dess was doing in his work with chiffon. And even the designs use color in the same manner that his other mentor Guy Laroche did, notably with reds and oranges. So really, it wasn't an original or a particularly special collection, as we know Valentino has admitted himself, but it was around 30 to 50% cheaper, had a much better quality than other designers in Italy due to his French approach, it had the provenance of Parisian couture, and it was presented in such a magnificent way that it caught the attention of the right media right off the bat. To quote Women's Wear Daily in 1959, they said, "His former training at Dess is revealed by skilled drapings in evening chiffon. Valentino's merit in his effort to give a useful look to difficult coats and suits." However, with all of that said, while he did have good reviews in general, it seems his first collection wasn't as much of a massive commercial success as well as some sources will have you believe. This is very, very normal in the world of fashion. Brands do not immediately make a profit. For most brands, it takes years. And so for Valentino, this was just no different. He may have had no worry for funds due to his backers, but he wasn't selling clothes from this collection at a rate that turned a profit. In fact, it really seems that if he hadn't have just bumped into Giancarlo Giammetti in the summer of 1960, the business may have just ended here. The two were drawn to each other immediately, and very quickly, noticing how much financial trouble the business was in, the then architecture student Giammetti came to help with the business. As he put in the documentary, he said, he doesn't realize the work behind the business past a sketch. And he wasn't wrong. Very shortly after meeting, Garavani's financial woes worsened really significantly after his father's associate had become disillusioned with Valentino after his first collection, which had cost a fortune in what Giammetti describes as panache, but hadn't turned a profit. And frankly, I'm not surprised. Giammetti describes in Menkes's book how he had commissioned chairs made of yellow silk for the initial business, and Countess Consuelo Creppi also describes that, quote, Valentino was always outrageously extravagant. Everything was of great quality. He was never intimidated by spending money, even at the very beginning when he didn't have any money. It didn't seem to bother him. So it's really no surprise that the associate withdrew his initial investment because he could not see much of a future in the business, retiring in the process in fact, and leaving Valentino on the verge of bankruptcy. This time was particularly hard for the two boys. To quote Giammetti himself in conversation with Menkes, he said, quote, after I met Valentino, it was hard work. 24 hours a day, I didn't know anything about fashion. I didn't know anything about business. We had to fight against bankruptcy. But in the end, it was Valentino's parents who came to the rescue once again, selling their country home to keep Valentino's business afloat. Though Valentino did have to move premises to 54 Via Gregoriana due to the lowered funds. Soon, they did close bankruptcy, hired a lawyer, and completely closed this first business, instead choosing to start completely afresh with a new Valentino Garavani brand. They didn't discuss the bankruptcy for many years following this. But either way, the new lodgings were just as luxurious as the last, just around the corner really, and right next to the Trevi Fountain still. Together, they had 3/4 of the large apartment on the first floor, which provided ample space for 2 salons, an atelier, office space, and fitting rooms. Quote, it was not really miserable, it was still in the center of Rome, still important, but there was a difference. It's a little unclear how, potentially from their discovery by Mexican millionaire Countess Claire Acquarone, who turned their business profitable with her orders, but it is from that September when their luck changed, as Italian actress Monica Vitti, who had known Valentino from their debut, met with Elizabeth Taylor on the set of Cleopatra while they were filming in Italy, needing a dress for the upcoming 1960 world premiere of Spartacus. She ordered a white dress from his second collection, which had been recently held in his studio at Via Gregoriana. To quote Elizabeth Taylor directly, quote, Valentino and I met in Rome in 1960 during the shooting of Cleopatra, and I became one of his first clients. He designed the clothes for Ash Wednesday and Night Watch. I've been wearing his clothes in my private and personal life ever since. I got hooked. His clothes are addictional. This changed everything. Spartacus was a massive hit, as was Elizabeth Taylor's gown, obviously, and it caused 2 major changes for Valentino. Firstly, his name was now better known across the world, flooding other celebrities and wealthy elite to his establishment, but more importantly, it opened Valentino to its very first license. The English department store Debenham and Freebody, which yes, is part of the Debenhams chain history for the people in the UK, Debenham and Freebody licensed the Valentino name and some of their designs for the reproduction of a series of their couture creations in a ready-to-wear fashion line. There is no information, unfortunately, on how long this lasted or even if it was popular, but in either scenario, for such a small business as Valentino was then, it would have meant a good influx of money and exposure, international exposure at that, which would have helped significantly get their feet off the ground. So the boys learned very quickly. the power of celebrity endorsement, and the power of ready-to-wear/licensing. If they were to grow the business, they would need both, and they were now more prepared to double down than ever before. 2 years later, the brand was still riding high on their celebrity endorsement and new branch of licensed ready-to-wear. But it was time to develop promotion on a new level. Giammetti, with a new contact in his pocket, headed to Florence to visit Count Giorgini, who was then in charge of Florentine Fashion Week. He requested a position in the Fashion Week from Giorgini, but all he had left was the finale spot for the last day. Nevertheless, he accepted what he thought was to be a lowly position, and they adjusted their expectations of the kind of response they could see from their first on-schedule catwalk presentation. However, despite their lowered expectations, come the day of the show, the truly unexpected happened. The American buyers, who had already heard of him from his celebrity work, actually stayed in Florence to see Valentino. They were flooded with orders, something no other young designer that week could boast, and they even received orders from the famed New York department store Orbucks, who bought the licensing of styles from them to recreate on American shores, a deal which proved to be wildly successful and lucrative for both parties. Their punt for promotion worked, and really it became one of the main contributors to Valentino's burgeoning worldwide fame. The following Florentine Fashion Week, they were given what they considered to be a much better position. By 1963, Garavani and Giammetti were traveling to America multiple times a year to show their designs in the various major cities across the country. Another marketing move, of course, to champion the name Valentino with what looked to be their most favorable audience. Plus, it certainly helped that while continuing through this promotional push, something very novel for the time, Valentino's designs remained incredibly consistent, timeless. In buying a Valentino design, because they were consistent, the women buying them would never truly be out of style. Really, this was a huge factor in pushing the Valentino name. The women customers who looked effortless and timeless, influencing their friends to get to know the designer's name. In a time when the desire for ever-changing fashion was bubbling up, Valentino was the antithesis to this, and his customers found great value in that. The tour was a major success. They had reached out to the media and to buyers and was able to find themselves with many new licenses for their couture designs and were able to make contacts and sales with major couture customers like the Duchess of Windsor, Gloria Guinness, Babe Paley, and Jane Wrightsman, all of whom known for their timeless style and beauty. This was their new frontier, celebrity-endorsed ready-to-wear licensing. As Giammetti recalls, quote, "He earned a great deal of money that way." And yet, it didn't stop there. Soon Bloomingdale's had asked for a stock of 50 little red coats from Valentino's own ready-to-wear line, i.e., they didn't want to license the patterns for the couture work, they wanted their own ready-to-wear line. Now, Valentino didn't have ready-to-wear at this time, apart from the one license in the UK, so they had to think on their feet, and ended up making all 50 designs of ready-to-wear with couture techniques in their couture atelier in Rome. The quality was incredible, and because Italian craftsmanship was so cheap, they were able to provide this demi-couture at ready-to-wear prices. Soon came buyers like Miss Martha with boutiques in New York, Palm Beach, and Palm Harbor, to whom alone they sold 300 to 400 dresses. In an interview with the New York Times, her daughter, Lynn Manulis, said, "The ladies went absolutely berserk. It was bedlam." Martha then interjected to say, "We bought more from Valentino that season than all the other stores combined, and all his private clients." Before long, the money that they had been making in licensing patents was soon eclipsed by their own Valentino ready-to-wear line. However, one thing I should tell you before we move on is that by the end of 1963, specifically their Autumn-Winter 63 collection, finally Valentino's slow but steady design evolution was starting to confirm its own leitmotifs. Obviously, we've discussed the 20,000 ideas that he had in his first collection, so all of these except one were technically there from the start, despite the fact that we don't really have any pictures. But it wasn't until now, a good 4 years later, that they became refined and really noticeable in his work. Namely, these were the Empire line, pastel shades, the play of black and white, animal prints, this is the one new to this season, and of course, the color red. The color red is obviously the most well-known of all of Valentino's signifiers. He had created literally thousands of red dresses in his time, and literally every collection he has ever made has had at least one red dress for good luck. Today it's known as Rosso Valentino and is made of 100% magenta, 100% yellow, and 10% black to create the exact shade, but there is conjecture over how the color came to inspire Mr. Garavani so devotedly. Aside from this book, which definitely hints that the Valentino red was inspired by his work at Guy Laroche, who was known for his work in reds and oranges, to be fair, there are two main stories that Valentino has told, recurring both before setting up his own label, that came to inspire the red. The first is that he went to Barcelona as a student and at the opera saw a woman with greyed hair in a red velvet gown, to which he became obsessed. And the other is that his friend took him to Barcelona when he was 17, and at the opera there were garlands of red flowers across the room, and it struck him as beautiful. Obviously, these stories are rather similar, so I don't doubt something like this happened, but it's clear that in either scenario, when youthful, Valentino was struck by something red and he wanted to give that shock of emotion to his customers. Really, it's for this reason that his clothes sold. He made the most beautiful couture, and he certainly made the most beautiful ready-to-wear. It may well be true that, quote, Valentino has not made discoveries. This is something Valentino has said himself on many occasions, and it's often discussed when referring to his own designs. But what he did was to keep couture alive and keep giving women that shocking sense of beauty he felt in Barcelona on that day. In fact, from this one Autumn-Winter 63 collection alone, to quote a 1966 report from WWD, they sold to Lord & Taylor 5 coats, 1 suit and 1 formal pajama. Bonwit Teller took 3 coats, Saks 2 coats, Alexander's 1 coat and 4 evening outfits, Hesbro's 1 tent coat with slacks, a purple fox jacket and a Bayadere striped wool coat for evening. I. Magna took 3 copies of the Paint Ensemble in leopard-printed double wool gabardine, Montgomery Ward 2 daytime ensembles, Evelyn Burns 1 coat dress, Jerry Silverman 1 coat and 1 dress, Zelina 2 coats, Hannah Troy 1 evening dress and 2 dress toiles, and Orbucks 1 coat. Also, Ebony magazine bought a Valentino centering on daytime après-ski and formal wear. Obviously, it was mostly licensed sales to American buyers, as you can tell, but this would have raised a fortune for such a small business and would have made the Valentino name famed across exactly the right boutiques across the States. By 1964, and after she had known his designs for 2 years, he had met and was designing for Jacqueline Kennedy after being introduced by Gloria Schiff. Jacqueline Kennedy had bought a large series of pieces, around 12 if not more, from the Autumn-Winter 64 collection, and from this, Valentino is even credited with getting her back up and out of the house after her husband was assassinated the previous year. Naturally, the papers endlessly reported on the many Valentino pieces that she owned, and business, of course, because of celebrity endorsement, further boomed. Within only a few months, they had 100 people working in their Rome atelier and at least 60 in Milan just to meet demand. The company that had gone bankrupt only 4 years before was becoming the most sought-after brand in all of Italy. From here, it was really only up. In 1966, he debuted a licensed lingerie collection that included hosiery, which I could not find the producer of. In 1967, he produced the V logo for the first time in a collection. They debuted more licensing in bags adorned with a gold V produced by Coppola and Topo. Raincoats were produced by Lawrence of London, which was a New York-based brand. They weren't from London. They released scarves, belts, sunglasses, and shoes, who I could not find the licensing for. He was commissioned to design the uniforms for the TWA staff. They produced their first print ad in this series of photos taken by Giancarlo Barbieri, which was in fact the very first advertising groupage, which are a group of adverts that find cohesion in a theme, an invention of Barbieri, in fact. For this exact Spring-Summer 67 campaign, they debuted the Valentino Uomo men's collection for the first time in Autumn-Winter 67, and at some point in 1967, they also had their own catwalk shows for their ready-to-wear line. I could not confirm when this started, but this is the first picture I could find of the ready-to-wear having its own actual catwalk show. The company was at the height of its fame thus far. Big celebrity endorsement, huge licensing deals. That print ad, whose importance cannot be overstated, specifically because adverts up until this point were mostly just the fabric houses, so not for the designers themselves, so it was in fact very, very important as a development. They had a thriving couture department and a new logo that was on everything from shoes to buttons. It's no wonder, therefore, that investors started knocking. The first investor to be interested in Valentino was a shoe company called Beck, who, having likely been recommended by Revlon, who were in talks to start the Valentino perfume line, approached the boys with an offer of around $5 million, which would be around $46.5 million today, for 100% of the business. It was a huge sum of money. They literally couldn't turn it down. Beck sent lawyers and the boys showed up to the subsequent meeting, but the guys from Beck then just didn't show up, instead sending the lawyers to turn down the offer that they themselves had made. Though perhaps this was for the best, because for the Spring 1968 collection, despite the trend for colourful 1960s collections, Valentino showed an all-white collection named Collezione Bianca, and it became the defining collection of his career. About 150 looks, many of which adorned with the now iconic V logo, in creamy ecru white or beige but no pure whites, though with one or two in navy, walked down the catwalk for about an hour and a half, only to be followed by a solid red outfit right at the end. A shock to the eyes and a shock to the press. The collection was discussed endlessly from this point onwards and truly pushed the name Valentino into the leagues of top designers. From the back of this, underwritten by Minouche Leblanc, Isabelle de Castellan, Patino, the Duchesse de Cavaillal, and Les Gautier, in May 1968, they opened their first standalone ready-to-wear boutique in Paris on 42 Avenue Montaigne, right next to Dior. The underwriters were planning also to run the store, so in a way it does sound a little like a franchise, but in a colossal 3-story space with 300 square foot facade that came with its own demi-couture ready-to-wear line named Valentino Boutique, produced still in their own couture atelier, just like the collection at Bloomingdale's. However, while the opening of the Valentino Boutique was incredible for the presence and development of the brand, it was far from the most impactful thing that happened for them in 1968. You see, in the same year, they designed Jackie Kennedy's wedding dress to her second husband, something widely expected after she was known to be a fan, and after the suspiciously timed all-white collection gave her countless options to choose from, including, as it was later discovered, 12 designs designed specifically with Jackie Kennedy in mind. This was the event of the season. Newspapers covered it endlessly, and the name Valentino was included in nearly all of those. In the end, this one event had an incredible impact on the awareness of the brand of Valentino, much more so than anything that had come thus far. In fact, this one event was so impactful that this dress alone saw 60 couture sales in the same model directly from Valentino. And from the same collection, sales from other department stores who were licensing the pattern really exploded, including, quote, Lord & Taylor 26 models, of which 900 copies were sold by Lord & Taylor alone, Marshall Field 22, Alexander's 19, Orbuck's 18 coats, and 12 evening dresses. It was the biggest year of business they had ever had, and certainly proved that they were right that their plan of celebrity-endorsed licensing was hugely lucrative. And it also proved that they were very fortunate not to sell to Beck just the year previous. However, the Beck deal certainly would not be their last offer. In fact, in 1969, Valentino was actually sold to Robert Kenmore, who was attempting to make the very first mega parent company for a luxury brand, something akin to what we would know today from LVMH. Namely, he wanted to buy Cartier, Marc Cross, Georges Janson, Kenneth J. Lane, and Valentino, among others, under the one roof in a massively large luxury mall. It was an incredible and ambitious idea for the time, and as part of that, Valentino was bought by him for $5 million. Garavani would continue his role of head designer, and Giammetti would stay on as managing director. And honestly, while you may think this sounds like a bad thing, it ended up being quite the push for the company. They opened their first store in Milan in the October of '69 in Via Santo Spirito. In 1970, they globally launched the ready-to-wear collections in New York and Rome. Soon came boutiques in Imagna in San Francisco, Nanduskins in Philadelphia, and Nunsters in Denver. And in 1971, they opened their first menswear store and their first home furnishing store, both in Via Condotti. But the best part of all of this? Valentino had this enormous influx of investment from Robert Kenmore, literally millions poured into the business. And then in 1971, Kenmore went bust, and the boys managed to buy back the now heavily expanded business with apparently more than 50 loans from banks covering over a third of the buyback price, which was only $1.5 million, so less than a third of what they had sold for. Though by the sounds of it, they were never paid the full $5 million, so it's a little unclear how much they made off of this, if anything at all. Nevertheless, anything they did make did go back into the business, and they opened more stores in Geneva and Lausanne by that November, and another store on Sloane Street in 1974. But before we move on from 1974, there was actually a very major change to the ready-to-wear Valentino boutique line that happened in this same year. Considering its notable success, helping to open all of these aforementioned boutiques, all of which stocked the line, the production required was becoming more than their atelier could handle. And frankly, they were making products at way higher of a cost than was remotely necessary because of it. So, on December 11th, 1974, they signed a deal with Mendes to produce the lines in their factories in France. Now, Mendes was the premier demi-couture manufacturer in France at the time, producing for all of Jean Des, Guy Laroche, and Yves Saint Laurent, and so it was a big deal to have their products made by the best of the best in France. Also, for Mendes, it meant an expansion on which designers that they could supply for too, as thus far they had only really worked for French couturiers. This marked the first time that their ready-to-wear lines were actually produced in France, and so gave the Valentino company an in to showing on the French ready-to-wear Fashion Week schedule. Now, we've discussed how xenophobic the French fashion scene was supposedly at this time already, but what I haven't told you is that it was still very hard to get into, especially for the Italians, as their work was seen as a cheaper alternative. In fact, the last designers who had tried to go across were Simonetta, Fabiani, and Capucci in the early 1960s, and they had bombed so badly that it basically ruined their careers. So, for Valentino to attempt this was not only risky, but it was genuinely bold. His Parisian debut would be for the Autumn-Winter 75 collection on the 9th of April 1975 at the George V Hotel. And it was a smash success. "It's the way rich women want to look," said Carolyn Weimer in the New York Times article devoted to the collection, a story titled "Valentino Revives Elegance for a Chilly April in Paris." By the next month, 2 new boutiques in Paris were erected, one on the Faubourg Saint-Honoré, and the biggest boutique thus far, a 500 square meter colossus at 19 Avenue Montaigne, their 51st store. By September, more would join. They would open a new 5th Avenue boutique on 677 5th Avenue between 53rd and 54th Streets after closing the previous one 3 years before, as the New York Times very shadily says, possibly because of its claustrophobic decor and lack of stock. a Tokyo boutique in 1976. 1977 saw 3 more points of sale in New York in Bonwitella, including one for Couture, one for Uomo, and one for Più, which is their homeware line. On the 16th of October 1978, they also debuted their much-loved Valentino fragrance, Valentino, produced in license with Unilever. Before long, they had 70 individual licensing agreements, including luggage, handbags, umbrellas, handkerchiefs, ties, belts, bathroom goods, bed linen, children's wear, babies' clothes, shoes, Vogue paper patterns, jeans, and 35 different licenses in Japan alone, soon to be quoted as 40 though, including pens, furnishings, and cigarette lighters. However, while other brands were more careless in their pursuit of profit with these licensing, Valentino kept these incredibly close to their chest, and they very closely managed them. Quote, according to Robert Bruno, Valentino's former assistant and longtime licensing designer, as quoted in a grand Italian epic, all the designs came from Valentino. From his collection, we would take some details like roses or bows. We would take his bow and try to transfer it onto bags, shoes, umbrellas. But he, Valentino, wanted to see everything. So everything that was on sale had been seen by Valentino. They were very, very careful with what they licensed and to whom. They understood that the brand value was more valuable than any short-term gains could possibly be, explicitly not taking any deals that had the risk of devaluing the company image. Interestingly, by 1979, this careful overview even entitled cutting ties with Mendes in France for the licensing of the Valentino boutique line and putting all of their eggs into a company named GFT, or Gruppo Finanziario Tessile, to get in on the newly increasing popularity of Italian construction, which literally because of Valentino was now becoming seen as consistent, reliable, and luxurious. Though really it was together through the 1980s with GFT, when they were growing to be a billion-dollar business, that they truly popularized the Made in Italy tag in both clothing and accessories. So this, though risky, was a good choice and was certainly cheaper than Mendes, something that was good for their predominantly American and Japanese audiences who were more open to cheaper ready-to-wear. As a result, it made far more sense to open their first administrative offices in the US and in Japan, where they could more closely regulate their biggest markets as much as they were keeping close administration on their licenses, which by 1981 would now expand to a car named the Alfa Sud, which was a Valentino red car. By 1982, thanks quite largely to their partnership with GFT, the Valentino company was bigger and better than ever and had grown significantly off the back of their licenses. However, I would like to point out that none of these licenses would have been possible if the Valentino couture and ready-to-wear were not as consistently desirable as they had always been. Valentino's design may have been extremely slow in evolution, but it stayed with the times and translated the same signifiers of the brand well season after season. In fact, he has a wonderful quote about this to say, "I believe only in high fashion. I think a couturier must establish his style and stick to it. The mistake of many couturiers is that they try to change their line every collection. I change a little each time, but never too much, so as not to lose my identity." This really sums up the Valentino ethos so well, and is really how the brand was able to be split into such distinct themes and variations for the 1982 Met exhibition based on his beautiful body of work, validating his slow design ethos further and boosting their validated profile in the fashionable world. By 1986, with their licenses going strong, their risk at going with a new manufacturer had paid off in spades. They debuted a new youth line named Oliver, either in 86 or 87 depending on the source, and soon found themselves in a much larger 12,000 square feet Roman headquarters at the Palazzo Minanelli to house all of their needed administrative works. And it was from here that they would take the next huge step in their business, by debuting their Alta Moda on the Paris Haute Couture Fashion Week schedule. Unfortunately, the first collection, Haute Couture Spring 1989, maybe didn't seem to go down too well. Just all of the many books that I was reading for the research in this conveniently skip over how well the debut actually went. And really, this review from the New York Times, which is pretty much all I have to go on, is kind of mid. It just kind of describes what the show was like and doesn't really go into any positive feedback whatsoever. But it is explicitly stated that his second collection, still within the same year and inspired by the Wiener Werkstatt, drew great acclaim, and it was this collection, really, that helped him successfully transition into Paris, as no other Italian designer since the war had achieved. Now with the successful collection from the Paris Haute Couture Fashion Week schedule, exposure and admiration of the Valentino brand once again continued to boom. And so they continued to open stores across the world to meet that demand, including one notable 10,000 square meter place in Rodeo Drive that was dedicated to the Valentino boutique, Uomo, and Oliver lines. But this would also really mark the end of an era. While Valentino had expanded really heavily through licensing, it was now time to attempt to consolidate as many as they could in order to remain brand equity. This move really cut revenue hard. They were making $12 million a year in Japanese royalties alone. Of course, they kept some. The boutique line wasn't going to go anywhere, for example, but this company had grown 40 to 50 times its size on licensing almost alone, and they needed to adapt for the times to protect itself and protect the longevity of the business. By the end of the 1990s, with their brand name maybe a little bruised but certainly intact, Valentino was still one of the big dogs. But a new threat had arisen. As of 1997, many of the big brands had been swallowed up by a parent company conglomerate. Whether it was the Prada Group, LVMH, or PPR, they were attempting to make the high luxury parent company that Robert Kenmore had once attempted in 1969. And they were really succeeding. Obviously, Valentino knew they couldn't survive without joining a leading financial group or a conglomerate, and so they decided to sell their whole company before it got too late. In 1998, Valentino would be sold 100% to an Italian holding company known as HD Corp, or HDP, for around $330 million US. Famously, Valentino Garavani cried at the sale. However, while the new parent company was profit-focused and honestly really wasn't concerned with the fashion side of the business, fortunately their ambitions for the company were aligned, and the group made quick work of continuing the consolidation work that the Valentino licenses had begun. Now they boasted only 3 perfumes, sunglasses, and jeans, though it should be said that their diffusion lines, like the Oliver line and like the ready-to-wear, were still going, and they also had their own licenses within them. Together, the company grew nicely. They turned Valentino into even more of a celebrity than he already was, something initially masterminded by Giammetti, and they even had a very promising moment in 2001 when Julia Roberts' Oscar dress was widely reported on. However, while seemingly everything was going well in the public eye, potentially because of the cut licenses, behind the scenes, losses were amounting, going from 23 million euros in 1999 to 25.5 million euros in 2000, according to the New York Times. To quote Giammetti directly, quote, "When they believed the expenses were too high, they didn't understand that that's part of the capital. Because through that, we create a certain life, which is part of the business itself. People outside of fashion just look at numbers. You can be the most amazing businessman, but it's very difficult for them to understand the fashion world." Plus, to add to their dissatisfaction and substantial short-term losses, there were the never-ending rumors of Garavani's retirement. HDP was now desperate to cut their losses and tried to sell Valentino off to a decent buyer. It would take a while for the day to come, but in 2002, the company would be sold to Marzotto for either $210 million US, $240 million US, or $400 million US, depending on the source. It was under Marzotto in 2005 that, according to the New York Times, Valentino merged with Hugo Boss and Marlboro Classics to be established under a new SPA known as the Valentino Fashion Group, which would also oversee licenses from Gianfranco Ferré, Missoni, Principe, and Uomo Le Bol, as well as creating their own license in Red Valentino in 2003. By 2007, this grew Valentino to such an extent that Marzotto was able to sell an almost 30% stake to Permira for €782,000, or about $1.1 billion, valuing the company at $2.6 billion. Now, of course, this was the recently formed Valentino Fashion Group, not just Valentino on its own, and it consisted of 25% as Valentino, 62% as Hugo Boss, and 13% as Marlboro Classics, which, if you break it down, means Valentino was either worth $275 million for 30%, so around $960 million, or if you take the $2.6 billion valuation of the whole company, it was worth $650 million. This was great validation for all of the work that the Marzotto family had put in. However, when Permira wanted to buy more, everyone was quite worried. Permira was another money-focused company, and they could easily sell out their brands for short-term cash gains and not see the value in the stuff that kept the Valentino brand desirable. So, when another 24% was bought, then the final 46% was bought, all by the end of the same year, everyone was really frightened. Valentino had a new home, and Garavani wasn't even consulted. Not long after, in fact 2 months after his 45-year celebration, he issued a press release to say that he was retiring. It wasn't really a surprise. The next day, Alessandro Facchinetti was appointed Women's Wear CD, and 5 months after that, Matteo Marzotto also stepped down as president. Valentino's last show was on the 23rd of January 2008 in Paris. Everyone was in attendance at the Rodin Museum, and he received a standing ovation from the crowd. When asked if his career felt it had gone by quickly, he said, quote, "Yes, fast in a certain sense. If I think that my collection at the Metropolitan Museum was in 1982, to me, that was like yesterday. I did a lot." A few weeks later, in the following Autumn-Winter 08 ready-to-wear show, Facchinetti took her debut. Fortunately, this was actually to great success. Their vie for a younger audience had worked, and she had an unusually well-received first collection. To quote The Guardian, "The appointment of Facchinetti signals Sassy's ambition to win for Valentino a younger, less traditional audience than the 45 and 50-something ladies who lunch who currently make up the brand's core clientele." However, in a shocking turn of events, following her second collection that was also widely well-received, she was dismissed for not including enough Valentino signifiers. Strange really, when she was tasked with bringing Valentino to a young audience, and she was successful at that, but wasn't yet allowed the opportunity to actually see if her clothes would sell. In her statement to the press, she said, quote, "It was with deep regret that I learnt from the press that I would no longer be working with Valentino. This news came as a great surprise since the company's top management has not yet seen fit to inform me of the above." The Valentino company said they weren't to make a statement, but the next collection was to be made by the in-house team, while Garavani and Giammetti, neither of whom were currently working with the company, both issued their own statements. Valentino to say, quote, "I think it is a wise decision," and Giammetti to say, quote, "To pretend to transform and revolutionize the Valentino style is a utopia, which is a loss from the start. Valentino's style is very strong and recognizable, which can only be taken forward, with necessary updating, by those who love it, respect it, and above all know it perfectly." Honestly, from my perspective, it just seems like she got fired for doing exactly what she was hired to do. Also, in the end, it wasn't an in-house team that designed the following collection, Autumn-Winter 09, but instead the design duo Maria Grazia Chiuri and Pierpaolo Piccioli, who were already known for translating the Valentino design perspective into more commercial pieces, as they'd been hired by Valentino himself in 1999 for exactly this purpose, to expand their accessories department. Then, in 2003, they had also taken charge of the diffusion line Red Valentino as well when that was established. So once again, Valentino as a company would not vie for cutting-edge fashion, but extremely commercial fashion that was desirable and at the height of construction. But that's not to say that they didn't develop the brand's codes or their simple beauty formula. They did, most notably in 2010 when they introduced the rock stud in everything from shoes to bags to create an enormously trendy new signature for the brand. In fact, Piccioli was quoted in 2011 by saying, quote, "We keep the language but change the attitude." And in this, he sums up their role really perfectly. Valentino didn't reinvent the wheel, so neither would they. They kept it really similar to how it had always been, just updated it with tweaks to keep it desirable, as Valentino himself had done throughout the many, many years. And this is not a read, by the way. There is great merit in being able to translate somebody else's design ethos into a modern day, keeping old customers happy at the same time as bringing in new clients is by no means an easy feat. In fact, seemingly they did this so well that in 2012, the company sold again to Mayhoola Investments SPC, an investment company backed by a major private investor group from Qatar owned by Qatar royalty, initially in an undisclosed sales price, though it was later revealed to be around $858 million, depending on the source. Considering that this price is quite considerably down from the valuation of $2.6 billion from 2007, it is understandable why the price was initially undisclosed. But upon further investigation, it was understood that most of the Valentino fashion group would in fact not be sold under that title. Literally only Valentino as a company and the Missoni license were in fact sold. So it is about the same valuation from the previous sale, back to its value when Garavani was heading the label in fact, which is a huge feat. Plus, as parent companies go, it was an interesting direction for the company. As, in a way well described by Harper's Bazaar, quote, "It also seems appropriate for the Middle Eastern couture clients who have been drawn to Valentino for their feminine yet often well-covering and modest design language." By 2014, Valentino had doubled sales. They'd seen a 57% increase on earnings and a 36% gain on revenue, half of which from accessories and primarily increased in US, Europe, and Asia. Even by the following year, the design pair won the CFDA International Award for their turnaround of the company and their incredible design language. However, just as things were really looking to boom once again for the company, Maria Grazia Chiuri would announce her departure from the brand, citing plans to go to Dior. The first show without Chiuri would debut on October 16, 2016. I'll be honest. To me, I thought the Spring-Summer 17 collection was a little similar to Alessandro Michele's Gucci that was all the rage at the time. However, with that said, for what Valentino stood for, it was obviously very perfect for its core clientele. It received pretty good critiques for this reason and began a great solo career for Piccioli in which he would come to be known as one of fashion's greatest colorists. He also established his own point of view in many other important ways as well. He developed his own signature pink color over the seasons, bringing men's couture to the catwalk in 2021, and in autumn-winter 22, producing that all-pink catwalk show that harkened back to Valentino's all-white collection and really extremely invigorated desirability back into the brand. It's no wonder, therefore, that very shortly after that undeniably show-stopping collection, solidifying Valentino as one of the top brands in the industry, that it would become a desirable acquisition for a new buyer. Kering announced the acquisition of 30% of Valentino for a cash consideration of 1.7 billion euros with the option of acquiring the rest of the brand by 2028. Of course, this was obviously ushering in a new era for the brand. Kering, as the parent company to brands like Gucci and Bottega Veneta, are known to be more trendy, cool, and buzzworthy than they are known to be reliable in the way that Valentino has always been. Of course, this is a good thing to widen their brand mix, and honestly, it was probably a good move for the company too. However, it did come at a very important loss. Pierpaolo Piccioli announced his departure with a very tearful send-off that had all of the fashion world really expressing their love for everything he had given the brand. Obviously, people were so interested in who would take over, and eventually old Kering alum Alessandro Michele would take up the reins. Now, this decision was met with a lot of skepticism. There was so much love for Piccioli before him, and many people didn't know how Alessandro Michele's design language would translate. And especially after the surprise pre-spring 2025 collection rolled out, no fewer than 171 looks, plus 93 more images of bags, shoes, and jewelry, people were a little worried that Michele would just repeat what he had done at Gucci, where they had claimed that his sales had been falling. There was inescapable discussion about this collection online, whether it was true to Valentino's design style or not, whether Michele's work was tired because of the many claims his Gucci sales had slumped, and whether he would be able to bring something actually new to the table that the fashion audience hadn't seen from his work at Gucci. And honestly, while I personally find that it is very true to 70s Valentino, I personally can see a lot of initial references here, I think it's more poignant to note how fervent this discussion was. Many people were truly angry that this didn't remind them of Pierpaolo's version of Valentino, which had been curated and developed so slowly over his time at the brand. From his personal debut in Spring/Summer 17 that I told you reminded me of Michele's work, until his final collection that really was its own design language. We had very slowly over time learnt who Pierpaolo was through his work at Valentino and his work outside in things like the Moncler collab. But this was also much in the same way Valentino's customer learned who he was through an incredibly slow transition of all of his many styles throughout the years, many of which I've shown you pictures in this video. This level of upset just went to evidence the true loyalty that this slow fashion grew in the Valentino brand that their fans have. And so while that initial debut was so controversial, as we're coming into Michele's catwalk debut in the Spring/Summer 25 collection, I expect it to once again both be controversial and to be well loved. I see so much of Valentino in Michele in that they're both designers with a very specific, unchanging idea of beauty that is confident and unwavering. This slow evolution of both of their design languages, their slow evolution of themes and signifiers, is what really drew customers to Valentino's work in the first place and to Pierpaolo's work. It is reliable and it's consistent. Honestly, it's for this reason that I think the recent announcement that they will be cutting out menswear shows, showing the menswear in the womenswear shows instead, and cutting the Spring/Summer Couture show, leaving only one Autumn/Winter annual Couture show, may be a good idea. It will allow that time for development, especially in the earlier seasons. In a way, it gives me hope that the company knows that it needs to plan for the long term, as Valentino had always planned. To quote Valentino himself via Goldman's 2008 book, quote, "I was never and am not a revolutionary designer, but I'm innovative in the way I always work to dress my woman with new ideas." And this 100% is something you could easily say of Alessandro Michele. He's not really a revolutionary designer in that he didn't really invent the things that he's putting onto the catwalk. But what he did is curate a world and curate a consistency which his customer can know that they can come back to reliably every single time they shop. This is not and has never been a brand for people that want hype. This is a brand for people that want to go into a store and know that they're going to find something that makes them feel beautiful. And I think Michele is certainly up to that job. The one curious point about all of this, though, is whether by 2028, Kering will acquire the rest of Valentino, as they still have the option to do. Especially after they had the Balenciaga scandal in 2022, it's unknown how much funding they have for the expansion of their business at this time. And I, for one, cannot wait to see if, firstly, they will continue this slow fashion approach to Valentino that we have come to know and love, or if it will become another one of their trendy hype brands as we have come to know and love Kering for. Thank you so much for watching this video. Please do like and subscribe. Check out my beauty channel Underskin for more videos like this one, but about beauty brands, and a special thank you goes out to my patrons over on Patreon, some of whose names are on the screen now. All content used in this video is done so in accordance with the principles of fair use. However, if you have any concerns, please contact me directly at contact@understitch.co.uk.